Hello, my name is Candace Savage, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual reading for One Book, One Province, Saskatchewan. We're coming to you today from the historic and beautiful Legislative Library of Saskatchewan in Regina. We're here located in Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'm going to be reading to you from this year's One Book, One Province, Saskatchewan selection. It's called A Geography of Blood, Unearthing Memory from a Prairie Landscape. One Book, One Province, Saskatchewan is an initiative of the Saskatchewan Library Association with the aim of increasing literacy and creating a reading culture by providing opportunities for residents to become more socially engaged in their community through a shared story. The project encourages Saskatchewan's social, economic, and cultural development while supporting libraries and collaboration. So we all hope that you will join us for an event in your area during March of this year. One Book, One Province, Saskatchewan month. The Saskatchewan Library Association would like to thank and acknowledge the partners and sponsors of this project. The Museums Association of Saskatchewan and M. Ironstar for creating this recording, the Legislative Library of Saskatchewan for providing this space, the Saskatchewan Writers Guild for ongoing support through their author readings program, the Saskatchewan History and Folklore Society for their generous loan of photographic images, and Sask Culture for continuing financial support. And that brings us to the focus of this event, which is this book, A Geography of Blood. Geography of Blood centers on the little town of East End, which, as many of you will know, is in southwestern Saskatchewan, but at the east end of the Cypress Hills. And my partner and I blew into town a surprisingly long time ago, almost 20 years ago now, and we ended up buying a house. Not because we intended to live there permanently, but as a kind of cabin. And one of the great appeals of this refuge for me was the reminder of the small prairie towns that I'd known as a child when I was growing up. So I'd like to start by reading you a few pages from close to the beginning of the book, not exactly the beginning, but the opening chapters, that attempt to capture this feeling of familiarity. I had left small town life for good, without the slightest twinge of regret, the year I finished high school. That was 1967. The quiet of East End that I now found so consoling had been intolerable to me then, and I remember fuming about the airlessness of small-town thinking, the smug white gloves on Sunday assurance that there is one correct answer to each of life's questions. This comfortable self-assurance had frequently found expression in a homespun myth, the epic saga of Western settlement. Here was a story so glorious that even my teenage cynicism could do little to tarnish it, a story in which I could cast myself vicariously among the heroines. Back in the 1700s, my own ancestors had left Europe, crossed a perilous ocean, and faced a wild continent rather than betray their heart's convictions. My dad's people had been Swiss Anabaptists who, in a quest for religious freedom, had fled first to Pennsylvania, then as pacifist refugees from the American Revolution to Upper Canada, and finally as settlers to Alberta. My mum's family, though on the opposite side of the religious controversy, had followed a similarly convoluted path. They were Roman Catholics who, forced from Portugal and then England, had settled in Maryland in the 1600s. When that refuge had also failed them, they had resumed their migration, heading inland to settlements in Kentucky and then Missouri, before they too made the trek to the Canadian prairies. Both lines had held strong to their religious convictions until the early 1900s, when at opposite ends of Alberta, my paternal grandfather and maternal grandmother had each broken with tradition by marrying outsiders. In other essentials, however, even these renegades remained true to the family heritage as they devoted their lives to bringing the prairie under cultivation and laying the groundwork of community life. My parents had both grown up on homesteads, and my sisters and I used to beg our mother for stories of her childhood, as fabulous to us as Greek myths. Imagine riding to school on horseback, or making butter with a stoneware churn, or lying in the grass watching fleets of flat-bottomed clouds float overhead. These borrowed memories came back to me in East End in the company of friendly ghosts, and especially during evenings in the Stegner House, itself a vestige of the pioneer era, this house in which the famous American author Wallace Stegner had lived as a child. Curled up on the couch in a pool of lamplight with a dog at my feet, I opened Stegner's Wolf Willow, looking for confirmation of these honeyed stories. What I found instead was an atmosphere of melancholy that I hadn't noticed in any earlier encounters with his book. By most estimates, Wallace Stegner confessed in his opening chapter, including most of the estimates of memory, Saskatchewan can be a pretty depressing country. Despite his rapturous reappraisal of the landscape a few pages later, grassy, clean, exciting, his memories were permeated by a sour whiff of disappointment. Stegner's father had been a hard-luck gambler, a man who staked his family's fortune on 320 acres of sun-scorched, wind-scoured prairie, a hard day's drive to the south, and who then, through the successive misfortunes of wheat rust, fire, and drought, had lost the toss. My father did not grow discouraged, Stegner recalled. He grew furious. When he matched himself against something, he wanted a chance to win. By 1920, he was already down in Montana, scouting around for some new opportunity. The family left for Great Falls the following year, and then for Salt Lake City, where they settled in like a wind-blown drift of Russian thistles. Fortunately for my peace of mind, the members of the East End Arts Council who run the Stegner House had provided another account of the settler experience that struck a more cheerful note. Entitled Range Riders and Sodbusters, it had been published by the local Historical Society in 1984 as a tribute to our pioneers. We record these stories with awe, the editors wrote, aware that this area had its definite beginnings in these stories, never again to be relived, and an era in history never to be repeated. Completely typical of the genre, books like this one had been compiled in communities across the prairies as the old-timers began to fade, including a couple that featured members of my own family. It consisted of capsule biographies of the founding fathers and, somewhat grudgingly, the founding mothers of the area. Who could resist the smiling faces that gazed shyly out of these pages, or their stories of heroic determination? One of the pictures that caught my eye showed an atypically somber-faced man in a three-piece suit, standing aslant to the camera and clasping the hand of a sturdy woman with back-swept hair and a four-square stance. Their names were Edmund and Marie Nibus. As Marie proceeds to explain, they had come to Canada from Belgium in 1912, along with their 5-year-old son, and arrived on their homestead in the middle of a blizzard the following autumn. Their first home on the prairie was a 2-room shack, punctured with knotholes and furnished with little more than a stove, a table, and a bunch of apple boxes. It had a brand new board floor, Marie recalled, and I thought it was wonderful. Life on a homestead had a lot of hardships, she continued. I think young ones are spoiled nowadays. Many were the days I'd go out and disc with 4 horses. I'd had to take my son with me, and he sat on my knees while I drove. We'd stay out morning till evening, then figured that the horses needed a rest. A note at the end of the entry informs us that Marie and her husband Ed lived and worked on their farm until 1954, when they retired into town. They died there, aged 94 and 101 respectively, in the early 1970s, shortly after celebrating their 64th wedding anniversary. I spent hours leafing through this volume, with its tales of runaway horses and broken machinery, lightning strikes and blizzards, good crops and bad, all animated by a surprising lightness of spirit. Even the 1918 influenza epidemic could be construed as having had unexpected benefits. There was an atmosphere of togetherness that united the community, one survivor recalled. Truly, these folks were the best in the world. Reading between the lines, it appeared that this same togetherness had helped to bring the community through the terrible 30s drought. With no crops, no money, in debt and on relief, times were hard, one old-timer admitted. But we got along somehow. There were picnics, dances, and parties. The women would bring lunch, and the men paid a quarter. Part of this bought the coffee, and the fiddlers were given the rest. Hard work and fiddle tunes, bread and roses. Through sheer stick-to-itiveness, these dauntless people had created not only farms and ranches, but also churches, libraries, hospitals, and schools. They had played in dance bands, organized Christmas concerts, and planned community fairs. They had raised flocks of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Even though I had never met any of these people, I recognized them as my own. Here I was in East End, home away from home. But of course, that wasn't the whole story. And the book goes on to investigate a much more traumatic and darker episode in the history of Western Canada, the history of the settlement of Saskatchewan in all our story. And I'm going to leave that part of the story for you to explore on your own. But don't worry, you're not going to be left entirely by yourself, because you will be in the company of 2 people who helped me to cope with what I was learning. One of them is an elder from Niganit First Nation. Her name is Jean Frances Oakes. If we could all have her for a grandma, we would all be very happy. She's a person of great good humor, and of courage and resilience, and I know you will enjoy meeting her. And the other is a man named Narcissus Blood. And so now I'd like to read you a few pages from the very end of the book. So we're just going to fast forward to the end of this volume, and I'm going to introduce you to the late Narcissus Blood. There's one place I want to take you before I bring this runaway steed to a halt. It goes by the unromantic name of the Stampede Site, and to find it, you simply let your mind wander west from East End and over the Alberta-Saskatchewan line toward the highest height of the Cypress Hills at what used to be called the head of the mountain. There, on land that was once home to the Niitsitapi, then promised to the Nakota, and finally incorporated into Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park, you will find the picturesque resort town of Elkwater, Alberta, and a series of signposts that direct you to an event at the local rodeo grounds. It's June, and the place is abuzz with school kids who have been bussed in from near and far for an attraction called History in the Hills. The main attraction is an array of glowing white teepees, some painted and others plain. that are dotted across a grassy field. Off to one side, there's a portly little bell tent of the kind once used by the Northwest Mounted Police, and a couple of four-walled trappers' tents. One of them has a Red River cart parked beside it. Métis fiddle tunes alternate with the throb of powwow songs, and from inside several of the teepees, a low murmur of voices is heard as the children listen to speakers from the Cree, Nakota, Siksika, and Métis nations. But we haven't come here for the festivities, as inviting as they are. Instead, our destination is a stand of aspens, a shimmer of tender spring green that is just visible on the opposite side of the field. Here, in a dazzle of sunshine, we have an unusual chance to gaze directly into the depths of the past. At our feet lies an enormous sheer-sided pit, big enough to swallow a house. Almost 30 feet on a side and 20 feet deep, it was dug by archaeologists, trowel and dustpan in hand, over 6 summers in the early 2000s. The walls of this human-made crater are striated with light and dark, reminders that the earth is constantly inconstant. Light-colored layers represent wet spells, when a nearby creek flooded its banks and covered the ground with silt. Dark bands represent dry times, when soil accumulated. There is even a deposit of ash from a volcano far to the south that spewed debris across the plains thousands of years ago. Yet no matter what happened, whether floods or droughts or tectonic ruptures, bands of buffalo hunting people kept coming here to camp. They were here 8,000 years ago when someone dropped a bone needle as white as ivory and as delicate as a stem of grass on ground that now lies 20 feet beneath the surface. They were here 7,000 years ago when someone else put down a stone awl, its surface polished smooth as glass, and forgot to pick it up. In all, the site has yielded nearly 1 million artifacts, going back almost 9,000 years and documenting the repeated presence of people in this place over hundreds of generations. Each generation followed in the footsteps of those who had gone before. In fact, new arrivals sometimes situated their camps on the very same spot their ancestors had used in the past, whether 10 or 100 or 500 years before. The Stampede site has recorded this act of remembrance as a sequence of subtle basins or hearths filled with charcoal and bone, each one stacked directly on top of the one below. It appears that the Buffalo people had a relationship with this place that they maintained by visiting it, almost as if it were a person. It just so happens that on this particular June day in the 21st century, during History in the Hills, a group of thoroughly modern people has come here in the hope of renewing this ancient connection. A mixed party of students and instructors and elders from the Nitsi Tapi teacher education program, they cluster around one end of the excavation and listen as an archaeologist explains what his research has revealed. When the 1,000-year-old awl is passed around, the guy standing beside me murmurs that he has seen that same ultra-smooth finish before on objects in Kainai medicine bundles. Curious, I look up to see a tallish man with deep-set eyes, graying temples, and a ball cap perched on his head. He introduces himself as Narcissus. I'm not sure who had originally told me about Narcissus blood and his mission to reconnect with the sacred landscape of the Nitsi Tapi. But there's no doubt about it. Here he is in the flesh. Later that same day, I managed to distract him for a moment from his duties as co-leader of the teacher training class to offer him tobacco and ask for help. I tell him about the new version of the settlement story that I'd been required to learn, one that acknowledges the violence that was done both to the buffalo prairie and to its human inhabitants, to the people who were settled here long before settlement began. But what was I still missing? What were these hills trying to tell me that I still couldn't hear? Might he have time to clue me in? For a long moment, Narcissus doesn't answer. Then, just as I'm about to break the silence, of course, there's no reason, I perfectly understand, he tips the cap to the back of his head and surprises me with a yes. How do you deal with the grief? He says, his gaze fixed on something that I cannot see. It is really a very short time since contact. 100 years is a long time, but not in Blackfoot time, not in Buffalo time. He pauses and looks at me. The knowledge that was here in this land for thousands of years has been ignored, he continues, his voice matter of fact. You can't be sustained without knowledge of the land. What we're talking about here is survival. There's just one catch to Narcissus' offer of assistance. To understand the Cypress Hills, he says, it's not enough to know them in isolation, as an island apart. They have to be seen in relationship with other sacred places. I can feel my ears prick like a coyote's. What on earth is he talking about? That's when you begin to understand that the renewal stopped for a reason, he goes on, weaving a web of meanings I don't immediately grasp. That's when you begin to see that a lot of knowledge can be recovered from the Blackfoot language and from the land. Even though, yes, a lot has been lost, it's not too late for things to start again. We have to begin thinking about our non-human relations. So it's in a state of bewildered anticipation a few weeks later that I find myself in company with Narcissus again, making the rounds of sacred places in southern Alberta. At Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump, he tells me that the stopping of the buffalo had caused famine not just for people, but also for the land and for all the insects, birds, and mammals that relied on their great, snuffling, dusty, shaggy abundance. The wolves, the vultures, the grizzly bears have lost their source of food, he says. The grasslands are no longer grazed, as only the buffalo know how to do. It's a famine that the newcomers, he means people like me, are only beginning to sense, and not enough people are aware of it. Then it's on to the Women's Buffalo Jump near Cayley, and from there to Okotoks, where we pay a visit to a monumental wing-shaped slab of quartzite that towers over bales in a hayfield. Every place we go, he tells me stories about Nappy, Old Man, and his sacred, comic misadventures. Late afternoon finds us in the farthest reaches of a cow pasture scarified by natural gas extraction. These days, we have a very violent type economy, my companion says, overlooking the dark, sinuous valley of the Bow River. Behind us, the Majorville medicine wheel extends its 28 spidery spokes to an enclosing circle of stones. Around us, a wide world of ochre and tan spirals out in every direction, and for a moment, I'm back home again, near East End, along the Frenchman River. How we are in these places, Narcissus will tell me later, that's how we would have been in the Cypress Hills if the connection hadn't been lost. Sometimes I think, like when you're on a hunger strike, there's a point of no return, but mostly I think the knowledge is still recoverable. Whenever we're in the car traveling, Narcissus sits in the passenger seat and talks non-stop, retelling the good old stories that belong to these special places. This is a storied landscape, a ceremonial landscape, he explains, as if aware that I'm struggling to keep up. very alive with its spirits and beings. Whenever we stop to visit a site, he is quiet and relaxed. "Don't you feel welcome here?" he asks me more than once, and he always takes time to say a few words in Blackfoot. Once I hear my name, and without waiting to be asked, he explains that he has prayed for me and for this book. "We come to these sites because our ancestors have prayed for us here," he tells me, "for the people who were not yet born. They prayed for us to survive, to do the things they had always done." Did they pray for people like me? I voice this question timidly. Not sure I want to know. "Do you think they will help me now?" I'm surprised to hear these words tumble out of my mouth. For a long minute again, he doesn't answer. "Yes, I think so," he says at last. "You made the effort. You came here. There is a lot more to know, but this is a good start." He flashes me a rueful grin. "Anyway, you newcomers are not going anywhere, and we aren't going anywhere either. I think it's a viewpoint now of we're in this together." This is a story that has to be marked, to be continued. So that brings us to the end of the book and to the end of the reading. So you won't have been able to tell this, but I'm actually not here just talking to the camera all by myself. There's a group of people here with me, and I have a feeling some of them may have some questions.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much for a wonderful reading, and ask you to talk a little bit about what you would like, or what you think the reader should take away from the book.
An author, a writer, can never determine what readers are going to take away from a text. I mean, obviously, this book is a reconsideration of the origin stories that I grew up with, the stories I believed were reflected how Saskatchewan's and Alberta's societies had been created, and I needed to rethink those stories. So that's what the book is about for me, about a relationship with the land, with this place, with my own ancestors, and with the people who have ancestors who've been here for much, much, much longer. But everyone who reads a book creates it for themselves. So I cannot determine what other people will find in it or feel about it.
Candace, in addition to physically traveling to East End, you seem to undergo an internal journey of some sort during the book. I'm wondering if you can tell us how researching and writing this book impacted you and your life and the way you see the world.
Some of the things that might not immediately be obvious is how enriched I feel by having found such good teachers, to use one of Jean Oakes's phrases. Such good teachers, these incredibly kind people who were willing to help me through these stories that they have known forever, of course. So I've made new friends. I feel more at home, I think, in my own skin and in my own home place.
Wonderful, thank you.
Although a geography of blood was written prior to the release of the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations, do you feel that your book addresses any of the recommendations?
Yeah, Geography of Blood was published in 2012, I think, so quite a long time. It was written, over the period before that. So certainly before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings were released. The recommendations from the TRC are mostly directed to governments. So as individuals, when we go to look at them, we think, well, I don't understand. What is there here for me to do? But I think if we go instead to the document that sets out the principles of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we find more guidance. The commission is called Truth and Reconciliation. So I don't know about reconciliation. I know a little bit. I have an inkling about what it might take to get us to justice. But it's clear to me that telling the truth about our relationships is really important and is the basis for change. So in that way, at least, I think this book does contribute. The other thing that was really important to me in working on this book was I knew I was going to need people from, in this case, from someone from within the Niigaaniit First Nation to teach me how these events resonated for her or him. But there have been a whole succession of well-meaning people who have gone to that community and other communities, to tell stories or to develop brilliant theories or whatever, to publish their findings. And it was really important to me to try as best I could to leave something behind that would actually matter, to be valuable, to leave behind something that began to approximate the value of what I was being given. I have come to the conclusion that that is impossible, that, I was given so much more than I could ever repay. But one thing that I did do was work with Jean Frances Oakes, the elder from the Niigaaniit First Nation. She told me stories which we then recorded, I transcribed, we edited them, I read them back to her, and together we produced this book called Stories from My Life. And so I know this matters to Jean, it matters to her son, it matters to some other members of that community. So as, insufficient as it actually is, it was a great pleasure to be able to leave something in that community that may be of lasting value.
Geography of Blood won the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction. Can you tell us a little bit about what that meant to you and maybe how you celebrated?
It was a pretty good day. So the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize, apart from having too many names, also comes with a very nice check. But it was my first and so far only experience of having national recognition. And that has certainly been, it's been very beneficial. It's meant that subsequent things, which only happened last year because these processes are so long, but meant that my next book got a little more attention than it would have otherwise. So I'm very grateful. And how we celebrated was, apart from, going out for dinner with my publisher, how we celebrated was having a big community party at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. Because I'm very clear that none of us do these things alone. We're helped in so many ways to create work. Without readers, without libraries, without fellow writers, it wouldn't happen at all. So it's a celebration that belongs to the community. So that's what we did. There was a chocolate fountain. Anything else?
What is the significance of the title, and can you talk about geography in relation to this book?
The title is not original to me. The title comes from Andrew Suknaski's Wood Mountain Poems. And in one of his most famous little pieces, he talked about claiming the right to chronicle the meaning of these vast plains, a geography of blood and failure. And so this book is about the way human experience is embedded in the land. And so it felt to me like, a godsend. Such a beautiful phrase. And I was lucky enough to be able to ask Andrew Suknaski in person if I might use it for the title. Of course, the book is very methodically set in landscapes. So every incident, every chapter in the book looks at the stories that are held in a particular place, whether it's the town of East End or the place called Chimney Coulee or Fort Walsh or the Niganit First Nation. The book, explores the memory that it belongs to that place. And then there's Narcissus reminding us that this is a land that's rich in stories and in ceremony, and that there are these places that we need to keep revisiting and have a relationship with. So we can tell ourselves the story of our present day in a way that starts in 1905, or that maybe starts in 1880. But this is an old, old country. It has so much to teach us.
Wow.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So that's the end of this virtual reading for One Book, One Province, Saskatchewan. We're very grateful to the Legislative Library for making us so welcome here. And we hope that you will read the book and talk about it. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. And for more information, you can go to the One Book, One Province, Saskatchewan website, which is www.onebooksk.ca. Thank you. Read on.